Hello, and thank you for joining me for our first installment of the RICO Report. My name is Cal Stein. I'm a partner at Troutman Pepper. I'm in our white-collar and government investigations group and our health sciences department, but above all else, I am a litigator. I'm a litigator with experience in both criminal and civil cases, which brings me here today doing this podcast about RICO. And I really like to think about RICO as the intersection of criminal and civil law. There are, of course, criminal RICO prosecutions, but even civil RICO cases, which we're going to talk a lot about, have significant criminal components because the underlying racketeering activity involves violations of criminal statutes. Civil litigators encounter RICO all the time, but to really understand RICO cases and to give yourself the best chance to win them, I have found that it helps to have an understanding of the underlying criminal components. I have worked with some truly outstanding civil litigators who have spent years winning complex business cases. They've seen every variety of breach of contract there is. They've litigated every possible business tort. They've won in court. They've won in arbitrations. You get the point. But maybe they've never dealt with a criminal wire fraud case. They know about common law fraud, but not wire fraud. It may seem like a small difference, but it can really matter when a civil RICO case rests on underlying racketeering acts of wire fraud. And this is why it can be so important to have both criminal and civil experience when dealing with RICO, and why I find the statute and its jurisprudence so fascinating. So with that, let's get started with the first episode of the RICO Report, where I'm going to provide a brief overview of the RICO statute and introduce the topics that we are going to explore in greater detail in future episodes. So what is RICO? RICO stands for the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. Back in 1970, the U.S. Congress passed RICO as part of the Organized Crime Control Act. But despite its name, RICO's application has not been limited to gangsters and members of organized crime families. To the contrary, RICO has been used by both federal prosecutors and civil plaintiffs to go after individuals and businesses that are alleged to have engaged in activities that Congress felt characterized the conduct of organized crime. So how does RICO work? Well, RICO is a bit of a unique statute in that it builds on other already existing crimes, and it then repackages them when certain criteria are met in a way that results in enhanced penalties. Let me break that down in a bit more detail. First, how does RICO build on existing crimes? Well, RICO does not criminalize new activities, and by this, I mean that RICO does not make any activities illegal that are not already illegal independent of the RICO statute. All of RICO's predicate acts, which we're going to discuss in great detail, are already crimes that are prohibited by some other state or federal law. Second, how does RICO repackage those crimes? RICO essentially says that when certain additional factors are present beyond those elements necessary to prove the underlying crimes, the defendants can be held liable for enhanced penalties. The two primary factors that lead to enhanced penalties are when the defendant is accused of participating in certain activities of an enterprise by committing a pattern of those crimes called racketeering activity. And we will discuss those two factors and others in greater detail. So let's now talk about the elements of RICO. And there are really four big elements. And throughout this podcast series, we're going to spend a lot of time, including some dedicated episodes, to talking about the elements of a RICO violation. We will dig deep into each element, provide examples, and discuss some of the key cases on each. But for now, in this introduction to RICO episode, we want to just list out the elements and provide a brief description of each so we all have a foundation on which to stand. So without further ado, the elements of a RICO violation are as follows. First, the RICO person. This is the most straightforward element. Only a person can violate RICO. But under the RICO statute, the word person is in fact a broad term. RICO defines it as any individual or entity capable of holding a legal or beneficial interest in property. There are some other nuances that come into play under the various subsections of RICO, and we will address those in later episodes. The second element that we're going to discuss is the RICO conduct. RICO implicates 4 types of illicit activity, each of which is found in one of 4 subsections of the RICO statute: 18 U.S.C. 1962A, 1962B, 1962C, and 1962D. Those 4 types of activities are, number 1, acquiring or operating a RICO enterprise. We will get to what that means in a moment, but using racketeering proceeds to do so. The second type is controlling a RICO enterprise using racketeering activity. The third is conducting the affairs of a RICO enterprise using racketeering activity. And the fourth is conspiring to so acquire, control, or conduct a RICO enterprise. And that dovetails nicely with the third element, which is, in fact, the RICO enterprise. And this is perhaps the hardest element to understand and articulate because it is a bit amorphous. RICO defines an enterprise as including any individual, partnership, corporation, association, or other legal entity, and any union or group of individuals associated in fact, although not a legal entity. So, really, the RICO enterprise is the group of persons who are alleged to have committed the violation. Now, the key language from that definition I just read is the phrase associated in fact. This standard is, dare I say, intentionally flexible. It requires only that the persons comprising the enterprise have some common purpose, a relationship, and longevity to pursue the purpose. And because RICO is a federal statute, the enterprise must also affect interstate commerce. That is not typically a difficult requirement, as things like using the telephone, the mail, or even internet connections will often suffice. The final element is the pattern of racketeering activity. And this element is at the heart of the vast majority of RICO cases. And really, it is 2 elements that are jammed together into one. There is the commission of, quote, racketeering activity, which is a term of art. And then there is committing enough racketeering activity that it constitutes a pattern. So first, let's talk about what is racketeering activity. And this is where RICO builds upon existing criminal acts and criminal law and enhances the penalties for them. So how do we know what does and does not constitute racketeering activity? Well, the drafters of RICO were actually kind enough to tell us, as the RICO statute contains within it a list of designated state and federal crimes that constitute racketeering activity. These are also sometimes called RICO predicate acts, and the terms are used interchangeably. RICO's list of racketeering activity is long, and we will analyze many of the crimes contained on that list in later episodes. But for now, suffice it to say that under RICO, the acts that constitute racketeering activity include those you would definitely expect, things like murder, kidnapping, arson, gambling. It also includes some things that you'd probably expect, like bribery, extortion, and money laundering. And it also includes some that you would not expect, things like wire fraud, mail fraud, or certain thefts of trade secrets. But as noted earlier, isolated instances of racketeering activity will not suffice. There must be a pattern, which brings us to the second question under this element: what constitutes a pattern? Much legal research and legal writing has been devoted to this very question. And again, we are going to do a deep dive into it in later episodes. But for now, the basic idea is that a pattern requires the commission of 2 or more racketeering acts that are related and that suggest or threaten a continuity of criminal activity. This formulation of the pattern requirement is often shorthanded as the continuity plus relationship test, and we will talk about that in much more detail in later episodes, about how to determine if acts are related and how close in time they must be committed. Okay, so let's turn now to the penalties. What are the penalties of a RICO violation? And as I mentioned earlier, the RICO statute works to enhance and expand penalties, both criminal and civil, that are imposed against defendants who are found to have violated the statute. And let's separate those from criminal RICO and civil RICO. Defendants who are convicted of criminal RICO violations face a range of additional penalties beyond those that would be imposed for the underlying Racketeering Act violations themselves. For example, something like kidnapping or something like wire fraud. There are sentencing enhancements. RICO violations carry significant prison time, typically up to 20 years. But it can be up to a life sentence if one or more of the predicate acts carries a life sentence. RICO violations in the criminal context also carry significant monetary penalties, which can be imposed in place of or in addition to prison time. The calculation of RICO fines can be a bit complicated. Sometimes it is a flat amount, up to $250,000 for individuals or $500,000 for organizations. But RICO also allows the imposition of monetary penalties based on the amount of gain or the amount of loss associated with the RICO offenses. RICO permits the imposition of a fine up to twice whatever the amount may be, which often results in fines far exceeding the $250,000 or $500,000 threshold set forth in the statute. The other big enhancement for criminal RICO violations is through the asset forfeiture process. Defendants convicted of violating RICO must forfeit any property or money they acquired through the RICO violation, including any property interest in the RICO enterprise. Again, as you might imagine, this can be very significant. On the civil side of things, defendants who are found liable for violating RICO in civil cases likewise faced enhanced penalties. This time, there's no enhancement for incarceration or prison time because we're in the civil world, but the civil enhancements take the form of treble damages primarily, which means a RICO plaintiff can recover up to 3 times more than they otherwise would bringing the civil violation outside of the RICO statute. RICO also permits successful civil plaintiffs to recover their costs and their reasonable attorney's fees. To state the obvious, these enhancements are significant, and they make any civil case where a RICO claim can be jammed in that much more attractive to both the attorney taking the case and the claimant pursuing it. It is precisely because RICO allows for more than 3 times the amount of damages normally available when attorney's fees and costs are taken into account, that we have seen the statute invoked time and time again in civil cases that appear on their face to be far afield from the type of racketeering activity Congress enacted the statute to combat. Unfortunately, circuit courts, district courts, and even the Supreme Court have taken the position that this is okay and have refused to dismiss such cases. We will talk about this a lot more in later episodes, but for now, it is important to understand both the mechanics of the civil penalty enhancements and the consequences of them. Okay, so we've covered a lot here today, but we are going to cover a lot more going forward in this podcast series. To recap, today I have provided an overview of the RICO statute, what it is, how it works, what its elements are, and how people are punished for violating it in both the criminal and civil courts. Rest assured, we are going to go into all of those topics in a lot more detail going forward, and I hope that you will join us when we do so. And with that, I want to thank everyone for listening. I hope you will join me for our next installment when we will be discussing the RICO conduct element and going over the 4 different sections of RICO, each of which addresses a different type of RICO conduct. If you have any thoughts or comments about the series, I invite you to contact me directly at callan.stein@troutman.com. And you can subscribe and listen to other Troutman Pepper podcasts wherever you listen to podcasts, including on Apple, Google, and Spotify. Thank you for listening and stay safe.
Copyright Troutman, Pepper, Hamilton, Sanders, LLP. These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman Pepper does not make any representations or warranties, express or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including, without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Pepper. If you have any questions, please contact us at troutman.com.